In 2024, a Chinese company charged an electric vehicle in 5 minutes. Not 20 minutes, not 15, 5 minutes. That is faster than it takes most people to fill a gas tank. Not just X. We are talking about a technological jump so large that the engineers at Volkswagen, Ford, and Toyota saw the data and immediately called an emergency meeting. And here's the thing. That charging speed, that is just the surface. The real story, the part nobody is talking about, is what that battery actually does to the entire economic architecture of the global auto industry. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why the world's biggest car companies are more afraid right now than they have been at any point in the last 100 years. And why this one piece of technology changes what is possible for every person on Earth who has ever owned a car. For decades, the single biggest argument against electric vehicles was simple. Charging takes too long. You pull into a gas station. 3 minutes. Done. You pull into a fast charger? You are looking at 30 to 45 minutes minimum before your car is ready to move again. Think about what that actually means, at scale, across an entire civilization that runs on cars. Highway rest stops designed around 3-minute fuel stops would need to be completely rebuilt. Road trip culture as we know it, gone. Trucking logistics, ripped up and rewritten. The entire petroleum distribution infrastructure that took 120 years to build, stranded, almost overnight. This is why the oil industry never really panicked about EVs. The charging problem was their moat, their safety net, the fundamental physical limitation that kept the internal combustion engine competitive even as electric motors became obviously superior in almost every other way. But here is the brutal catch. The charging problem assumed something. It assumed battery chemistry was basically fixed. That lithium ion was the ceiling. That the laws of physics had drawn a hard line and nobody was going to cross it. A company called CATL just crossed it. In April 2024, CATL unveiled a battery they called Shenzhen, named after the Chinese concept of a divine vessel, something that carries you farther than physics should allow. Here is what Shenzhen actually does. It delivers 1,000 kilometers of range on a single full charge. To put that in perspective, that is London to Barcelona without stopping, in an electric car. And it charges from 10 to 80% in 10 minutes. The Plus version, the one announced shortly after, does it in 5. And this is where things get seriously wild. The reason charging has always been slow comes down to chemistry. Lithium ions, the charged particles that store energy in a battery, need to move through a material called graphite when the battery is being charged. Graphite works, but it is slow. Forcing lithium ions into graphite too fast generates heat. That heat degrades the battery. Eventually, it can cause fires. Every fast charging limitation you have ever experienced in an EV traces back to that one physical bottleneck. CATL replaced the graphite with a superconductive graphene-doped material that moves lithium ions roughly 10 times faster. At the same time, they engineered the internal structure of the cell itself, the channels, the layers, the thermal pathways, so heat dissipates before it can accumulate. It is like the difference between pushing water through a garden hose and pushing it through an 8-lane highway. Same water, completely different outcome. The charging problem is solved, and that is just the beginning. Here is something wild to think about right now. When most people hear battery breakthrough, they think about the car, the range, the charge time. That is the headline. That is what gets covered. But the car is not the real story. The real prize is what happens when you take this battery, this chemistry, this manufacturing approach, this cost structure, and you apply it to everything else. Trucks, ships, planes, power grids, entire electricity networks. Right now, the single largest barrier to running the world on renewable energy is not solar panels or wind turbines. Those already work. The barrier is storage. The sun does not always shine. The wind does not always blow. To run civilization on clean energy, You need somewhere to put that energy when it is generated and release it when it is needed. Every grid-scale battery in existence today costs too much, degrades too fast, and charges too slowly to make 100% renewable energy systems practical at civilizational scale. Now here is where the real story begins. CATL did not just improve battery performance, they cracked manufacturing cost. The Shenzhen batteries produced on the same production lines, using a process that CATL calls cell-to-pack, where the battery cells themselves become structural components of whatever they are installed in. No extra housing, no wasted material. The battery is the chassis. That single manufacturing innovation cuts production costs by roughly 40% compared to conventional EV battery packs. Think about what 40% cheaper means. Not 5%, not 10, 40. It means the total cost of owning an electric vehicle drops below the cost of owning a combustion vehicle. Not just in theory, not just in favorable conditions, but across almost every market on Earth, including ones where electricity is expensive, including ones where consumers are price sensitive to the dollar. The economic argument for gasoline just disappeared. And this is where the Western auto industry's crisis becomes impossible to ignore, because building a battery like Shenzhen is not just a chemistry problem, it is a manufacturing problem. And the manufacturing gap between CATL and every Western competitor is not a few years, it is a decade, maybe more. CATL has 13 gigafactories operational today. Tesla, often considered the most advanced Western EV company, has 4. The entire European auto industry combined has fewer battery factories than CATL operates by itself. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was rushed. China spent 15 years building the supply chain, the raw material access, the engineering talent pipeline, and the government coordination required to produce this moment. And now the moment is here. But here is the honest version of what this tells us. The part that goes beyond the car, beyond the battery, beyond even the energy grid. This is not just a technology story, this is a strategic story. The 20th century was defined by one resource: oil. Whoever controlled oil controlled economies. Countries went to war over it. Trade agreements were written around it. Entire foreign policies were constructed to guarantee access to it. The 21st century is going to be defined by a different set of resources: lithium, cobalt, manganese, nickel, the raw materials that go into every battery ever made. Here is where it gets serious. China controls approximately 60% of the world's lithium processing capacity. Not mining, processing. The distinction matters enormously. You can dig lithium out of the ground in Australia, Argentina, or Chile, but to turn raw lithium ore into battery-grade lithium carbonate, the form that actually goes into a cell, you need specialized refineries. China built them. Everyone else did not. China also controls roughly 70% of global cobalt refining, and CATL, through its subsidiary and investment network, has locked up supply agreements on critical minerals across Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia that will take competitors years, possibly decades, to replicate. The Shenzhen battery is not just a product. It is the output of a supply chain so vertically integrated, so deliberately constructed, that building a competitor to it requires not just better chemistry, it requires rewriting the global raw material trade. That is not impossible, but it is a 10 to 20-year project minimum, and time is the one thing Western manufacturers do not have. Every hour that passes, CATL ships more batteries, builds more factories, and locks up more supply. Ford, GM, Volkswagen, and Stellantis are not slow because they are incompetent. They are slow because they are trying to rebuild from scratch something their competitors spent 15 years constructing, while simultaneously managing shareholders, union contracts, legacy manufacturing plants, and dealership networks built entirely around a technology that is now becoming obsolete. Picture a sprinter who spent the last 15 years training for a 100-meter race, only to arrive at the starting line and discover the course is actually a marathon, and their opponent is already at the 20-kilometer mark. That is where the Western auto industry stands in 2025. Now think about what happens next. Not in 5 years. In 20. Walk outside on a clear night and imagine that every car you see on the road was manufactured by a company that does not yet exist or does not yet dominate in the countries that built the car industry for the last century. Imagine that the gas station on your street corner has been converted into a charging hub, that the power flowing into those chargers comes from a solar array whose batteries were made in China, that the ship that delivered those batteries to your country was itself electric, its propulsion system powered by a scaled-up version of the Shinsing cell. This is not science fiction. This is the trajectory if the current advantage holds. There is a larger game being played here. Whoever controls the battery supply chain controls the energy transition. And the energy transition is the single largest infrastructure transformation in human history, larger than the railroad network, larger than the highway system, larger than the internet. That is not a small story. The International Energy Agency estimates that by 2040, the global battery market will be worth over $400 billion per year. $400 billion annually in a single product category that barely existed 20 years ago. And right now, CATL holds a position in that market that no Western company is remotely close to matching. There are responses. The U.S. Inflation Reduction Act directed over $370 billion toward domestic clean energy manufacturing, including battery production. The EU has launched its own battery alliance. South Korea's LG Energy Solution and Samsung SDI are pouring billions into expansion. Panasonic, partnered with Tesla, is scaling in the United States. These efforts are real. They are not nothing. But they are building toward a target that keeps moving. Because CATL is not standing still. Even while the Shinsing battery was still being unveiled, CATL was already testing its next generation, a sodium-ion architecture that eliminates lithium entirely. A battery that could be built from materials available on every continent on Earth. If sodium-ion reaches commercial scale, and CATL's engineers believe it will within 5 years, the supply chain advantage shifts again, this time in a direction that is harder for any single nation to control. Whoever figures this out first does not just win the car market, they win the energy market. And the energy market is everything. We started with a number, 5 minutes. But this was never really a story about charging speed. The charging speed is just the proof. Proof that the most important technological transition since the invention of the internal combustion engine is not happening in Detroit. It is not happening in Stuttgart. It is not happening in Tokyo. It is happening in Shenzhen, in Ningde, in 13 gigafactories across China, where engineers are doing something that most Western analysts told you was impossible 5 years ago. They solved it. Not partially. Not incrementally. Completely. The mode is gone. The argument is over. The only question left is how fast the rest of the world can respond, and whether the response comes fast enough to matter. You now know something that most people driving gas-powered cars today do not yet understand. The vehicle in their driveway is the last of its kind. The era it belongs to ended quietly, precisely, and without fanfare in the time it takes to charge a phone. If you want to understand what comes next, the sodium-ion race, what Ford and GM are actually building behind closed doors, and whether any Western company has a real shot at closing the gap, make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss that video when it drops. And I want to know what you think. Leave it in the comments below. Do you think a Western company, Tesla, Ford, a European giant, can actually close this gap, or is the race already over? I read every comment. Let's talk about it.